Hello everyone, I am Siddharthan. This is the 11th topic in our complete Python course where we are going to discuss about casting in Python. Casting is basically used in order to convert one data type to another. In the previous section, we have discussed some of the basic data types such as integers, floating points, strings, etc. So in this video, let's understand how we can do this casting so that we can convert one data type to the another. So this will be the agenda for today's video and let's get started. So we will be doing our coding part in Jupyter Notebook, but you can try Google Collaboratory or other IDE as well of your choice. So here I've given a definition of what casting is. So in Python, casting refers to converting one data type into another. It allows you to control how data is interpreted and ensures compatibility between operations that require specific data types. So this first sentence I've explained you that it's basically used for data type conversion. And in the next part what we have basically said here is, so some operation needs to be done on certain data types. Let's say that if we want to add two numbers, those two numbers should be integers or floating point numbers, but if those numbers are in the form of string data types, then we cannot add that, right? So these are some of the aspects where we have to make sure that the data types are compatible for that operation, and in some cases we may get the input in one format and we may have to convert that into a different format. So these are some of the usage scenarios where we will be using casting, and this is kind of a basic stuff that we use like often. So that's about casting, and now let's get into this hands-on part. So apart from this integer, floating points and other data types, we also have this list, tuples and so on. So that we will be discussing later, but for now let's just focus on this casting only for those data types that we have discussed before: integers, floating points, strings and booleans. That's what we are going to see today. So first I'll explain you about integer casting. So here we are going to convert different data types to integer values. So here let's say that we have the number 3.9. So we know that 3.9 is a floating point, right? It's a decimal value. So let's say that we are checking the type of this 3.9 using this type keyword, which again we have already discussed. So when I run this, it's going to say it is a floating point number, right? So it's a float value, decimal value. So if you want to convert this to an integer, you can say x is equal to, so this is the variable in which I'm going to store the converted integer value that I'm seeing here. So here I can say int of 3.9. So this int keyword that we have, which is an inbuilt keyword in Python, it's going to take in this 3.9 value and it's going to convert this float value to an integer value. So this is to, I'll put a comment here saying that this is float to integer. And then once we have done this conversion, you can print this x value. So here you are seeing that this 3.9 has been converted to a float, and you can also check this type of x again. So now it says the type is integer. So previously the 3.9 was a float, and later we have converted it to an integer. The main thing to note here is when we convert a float to an integer, it won't round it. So if you round this value, right, so 3.9 should be rounded to 4.9, but that won't be the case here. When you're just casting, this decimal value will be just removed. Even it can be 3.99. Even though in that case it won't round it, it will just like remove all the decimal values and keep only the integer value. So there is a different way for rounding, but let's discuss that like after a couple of examples here. So this is for floating point, right? So similarly, let's just like put all these things together. Let's say that x is equal to 4.5 and y is equal to integer of, let's say, x. So here we are assigning this float value to this x and later converting this floating point value x to integer and storing it in this variable y. And then we can print this y, also print the type of y. Okay, so it prints 4. So this 4.5 floating point has been converted to an integer value, and we also print the type as int. So we put this type in a print statement. So it says class, which basically tells us it's an integer object. So that's how you can do this conversion. But what if you want to, round a value, round a decimal value to an integer? So not an integer, but just like rounding of values. So for that, let's say that a is equal to round, take some number, let's say 5.678. So I want this to be rounded to two decimal places. So I can mention that 2 here. And then I can print this A, and also I can print this type of A. Okay. So this 5.678 has been rounded off to 5.68, and we now only have two decimal places, and this is a float. So when you do this round, it won't convert it to an integer, even if you have, like, let's say, you're saying that I don't want any decimal values. That means it should have only 5. But when you do this rounding, it would say 6.0. So this 5.67 has been rounded off to 6, but we have this dot 0 here. So you can use round, but it would only convert this to an integer. But what if, let's say, you want to round it and convert it to an integer? So in those cases, you can just do these two operations together. So I can just say int of round, let's say 10.9. So this 10.9 has to be rounded to 11. So here I can say 10.9 comma, let's say 0. I don't want any decimal value, so this entire thing has to be rounded off. And then I can print this a, and then I can also print this type of a. Let's see what's the output that we are getting. So now it says integer and the value is 11. So what basically happens here is, first we round this 10.9 to 0 decimal places. That means it will basically be converted into 11.0. And then this 11.0, we send this to an integer, and then we would get the final value as 11. So those are the two things happening. So first what would happen is, let me put this in the comment. So this 10.9 would be converted into 11.0, and then using this integer keyword that we have used, so we would convert this 11.0 to 11. So this integer conversion casting operation happens. So this is how you can round a decimal value and make sure that it is in the integer format. So this is like another use case. So we have discussed how we can convert a floating point to an integer. Now let's see how we can convert a string to an integer. Let's say that we have the variable as z, and here we are going to convert string value of, let's say, 40 to an integer. So here I can print my z, and then here I can print the type of z. So this is string to integer. So this is a number, but notice that we are using this within a double quote. So this will be considered as a string. So even though you use a number, if you put that in double quotes, that will be considered as a string. Or in other words, whatever is present with a starting double quotes and ending double quotes, that is considered as a string, even though it is a number. So when I run this, I would get this value as 40 integer. But if you check this type of double quotes 40, it would say it is a string. So this is how it would have previously been. So first it was string, and this string has been converted into an integer using this int keyword. So the next thing that we can discuss is float casting. So here we have seen how we can convert other data types to integers. Now let's see how we can convert integers or string to floating point values. So the second thing is float casting. So let's say that x is equal to float of 10. So we know that 10 is an integer value, right? So this 10 is going to be converted into a float value or a decimal value. So here I can say integer to float, and then I can print this x, also print the type of x. So it says 10.0. So this integer value has been converted into a float value. So the next example, similar example, I'll copy this entire thing, put this here. So now we are going to convert a string to a float. So in this case, let's say that we have some string convertible value, like let's say 40.7, but it's in the string as we have this inside double quotes. So now let's run this. So this 40.7 string has been converted into a float value or the decimal value. So this is how you can convert a string value to integer value to a float value, and a string value to a float value. So now let's discuss about string casting. So similarly, how you can convert integer or float to string. So it's like pretty similar stuff, and all these are like keywords in Python. As you can see, those are like highlighted in green color. So even this round is like an inbuilt keyword that we have in Python that we can use to round decimal values. So the next thing is string casting. So this is the third example. So here let's say that x is equal to 10, which is an integer, so that we are going to convert into a string. So use str keyword, print this x and also the type of x. So this is going to be integer to string. Oh, sorry. So this should be print So we have 10 integer, it is in the form of string. So here you may think that I don't know how to distinguish this string and integer. You can just say the variable name. So you shouldn't put this within a print statement, but just like put this within a cell without any print statement, and this works only in the case of like Jupyter notebooks. It's like better in this case. So when you put your x here and run this, your 10 will be in single quotes. But if it's an integer value, right? So if I have let's say y is equal to 10, which is an integer, if I put this y here, we won't see any quotes here. So this is how you can look in the output of whether a particular variable is a string or an integer. So whenever there is quotes, that means it's in the form of a string. Or you can also use this type keyword that we have. Okay, so next let's see how we can convert booleans into strings. So we know that boolean basically has two values. One is true and the other one is false. So let's say that boolean to string. So for boolean we have to say true or false, where the t or the f should be in uppercase letter. Okay, so when you run this, it says it belongs to class string. So this was a boolean before, so later this has been converted to a string, so we are printing it and then checking the type. But if you just check the type of this true directly, so it would say that it is a bool. That means it is a boolean class. So this again can be done for false as well, as it's like just similar to true. Put this f in uppercase, so we get this as a string. So this boolean has been converted into a string. The next example that we can discuss is how you can convert other data types to boolean values, and this is like, I would say this is an interesting and like slightly different from what we have discussed so far. So this is the fourth example. This is boolean casting. So let's say that x is equal to bool of 0 and print x and print type of x. So whenever you use this bool keyword for this boolean conversion, if the value is 0, that's going to be converted into false. So let me put this in the comments. So this converts integer 0 to false. Okay, but if you have the value as 1, this is going to be converted into true. So 0 means false and 1 means true in the case of boolean conversion or boolean casting. So here I'll just like replace the 0 with 1. Okay, so we get the value as true. And now let's see how we can convert string to a boolean. So let's say that uh, z is equal to bool of null. So here we basically don't have anything. So I just have this starting double quotes and ending double quotes. So this is what we call as an empty string or null string. So this null string is kind of used a lot when we want to initialize a particular variable but don't want to put any values. So like let's say we have the z value, so we initialize with this null string, and later in our code we would like replace that with some other value that we create dynamically. So this is what we call as a null string, where you create this with either two single quotes without any space. Even if you put a space, that's not a null string. So there shouldn't be anything. It contains only like opening quotes and the ending quotes. It can be single quotes, or it can be like opening and closing of double quotes. So both these are possible. So when you convert a null string to a boolean, let's see what's the output that we are getting. So here we would get this as, I'm checking the type of z, so it's going to say it's a false. But when you consider a non-empty string, that string can be anything. That string have like any text. So non-empty string is going to give you true, whereas the null string would give you false. Okay, so if I have something, right, so let's say that we have the text as Python, so that's going to say true even if you have this value as true. So this is not boolean right now because we have this in code, so this is still a string, so that's going to say true. But another interesting thing is that even if you put false, it's going to say true. That's because it wouldn't look at whether the value is true or false, or it's name of a person, name of a word or something. So it won't look at it at all the boolean conversion knows is if it is an empty string, convert it to false. If it is a non-empty string, that means if it contains some text in it, then convert it to true, even if it is a false or like any word. So that's how you can remember this. So null strings to false and non-empty strings to true. Okay, so the what's the text within that is like kind of like it's not important. So next let's see how we can do Complex casting. So complex numbers is other data type that we have discussed, right? So let's see that. This is the fifth one. Complex numbers castings. Let's maybe consider multiple examples. I'll say that x is equal to complex of I'll just consider an integer value, let's say 6, and y is equal to complex of, let's consider a floating point value of, let's say 8.9, and z is equal to complex of this we are going to convert it from a string value, let's say 2 plus 4j. Okay, so here in the first step we are converting integer to a complex value. The next step we are converting a float. So first is integer to complex, next is float to complex, next one is string to complex. Let's run this and also print all these things together. Print x. I'll just copy this and paste it two other times and replace this x with y and z, and we get the complex value as 6 plus 0j, 8.9 plus 0j, 2 plus 4j. This is because these values doesn't have any imaginary part, so we just like use 0j as the imaginary value. And if you want to check the type, you can just say print type of xyz, or like any values basically. So the class is complex, and this complex is the keyword that you can use in order to convert one data type to a complex number. So these are all some of the Python casting examples. So we have seen about how you can cast integer values, and then we have also seen how you can round the values and then convert it to an integer using casting. And then we have seen string casting, boolean casting, and finally complex number casting. So now let's discuss like maybe a couple of usage scenarios where we actually kind of use this casting. So let me make this as a text cell and say usage scenarios. So for this, first let's consider the input statements. Okay. So this input statements we have discussed already, but let's discuss that in terms of casting, use. So let's say that I have a variable called as user input, which is something that I'm going to get from the user. So here I'll say, open this double quotes and say enter your age. So we have already discussed that when you use this input keyword or the input function, it's going to ask the user for some value, right? And once they have given this value, we are going to print this, sorry. So we are going to print the user input and also their data type. So print type of user input. So let's run this, and this will prompt the user to enter some value. Let's say that I give the value as 40 as the age and press enter. So it's going to say 40 string. So the key thing to note here is, even though the user entered value is a number, a numerical value, it would be considered as only as a string value. So it won't automatically detect whether it is an integer value or a floating point value or something. So it will always consider whatever values that is given by the user. So those things will be considered as a string value. So in order to do this conversion, we would use this int outside this input. So I would say int and inputs. I would wrap this input within this int keyword, int function. So that's going to, once the user has given a particular value, that's going to convert it into an integer value. So when I run this, the user can give the value as 40 and press enter. But now this has been converted into an integer using this int function. So this may not work for every scenarios. If the user is not, they are giving something that's not acceptable, right? Let's say that I'm putting my name here. So that's going to create a value error because this word cannot be converted into an integer. So in the input statements also we have seen how we can validate this input. Maybe you can refer to that, but in general we should put only, like, let's say numerical values. I'm putting this as 50 and this would be converted into an integer. So similarly you can use this for floating point values as well. So instead of this int, use this as float, and let's say here we are saying enter your, let's say, weight or something in kg. So when I run this, let's say they are giving the value as 75.5 or something and press enter. So it says it's a float. So this is how you can get input from the user and convert it to a floating point value. So this is like one such scenario of where you can use this the data type casting in Python. The other scenario, maybe the last one that we can discuss is, let me put this, is string concatenation, which is also something that we often use. So the next scenario is string casting. And let's consider an example. Let's say that age is equal to 40 and I want to, let's say, create a message saying that message is equal to I am, put a space here. We know that we can concatenate string using this plus symbol, right? Age plus space years old. So what this should say is this should insert this age value along with these other things, and print that I am 40 years old. So that's what this should say, and we're printing this message. So when you run this, it's going to throw an error because this is an integer value and you cannot add integer value to the string values. So in these cases, this is what we mentioned when we said that, you know, uh, we have to maintain compatibility in order to perform some operation. So that's the reason. So in this case, instead of saying just age, I can convert this to a string here and run this. Sorry, message is not defined. Okay, let's run this, and it says I'm 40 years old. But if you check the type of a, it's still an integer. So we are not changing the variable's type. We're just like converting that and using it here, but the original variable is not changed. So that's something that you can remember. So the age is still an integer value, but while concatenating this with this message, we are converting this to converting this to a string value and concatenating this. So similarly, if you want to do some addition operations, right? So let's say that a is equal to 5 and b is equal to, let's say, 10, but the 10, it's in an integer format, and c is basically the addition of two things. So when you say a plus b and print c, that's going to throw an error because one is integer and the other one is string. So what you can do is, in this case, when you say c is equal to a plus b, this a has to be converted into an integer. So this is converted into an integer that says 15. But what if you convert b into a string? Instead of converting this a into an integer, we are going to have both these as strings. So think about this. So when I do this string of b, it's going to concatenate it, or in other words, it's going to join these two things. So that's how the plus symbol works differently. So this is what we call as addition operators, and we will be discussing about that when we discuss about this operators in Python. So this plus symbol is basically used to add two values when it's an integer value or a floating point value, but when two variables or the two values are strings, it's just going to join those two words or join those two strings. So here how this would be is, this would look something like this, or you can just perform the similar thing by typing this in Python. So let's say that 5, which is in double quotes, plus 10, which is also in double quotes. When you do this, this would just like give you 510, which basically combines these two values that we have. So that's the reasons, and this is how you can cast this one integer into a variable and you can work on it. So that is all I wanted to discuss for today in this particular video. So I hope that you understood all the things that we have discussed. So these are like pretty fundamental stuff, but we kind of use this often. We use this like a lot. So try these codes and let me know if you have any doubts on this. So that is all from my side, and I'll see you in the next upload. Thanks for watching.